I got quite an interesting request actually regarding a heavyweight called Ibeabuchi. Now, first things first, pronunciation may not be spectacular. I wasn't the biggest boxing fan when this chap was boxing. He's slightly before my time as a hardcore boxing fan. So we'll go with EK. I'm sure that's more likely to be right. The request was based on EK's short career and his future potential. Can we class him as a top 30 all-time great heavyweight? It's an interesting story. This I'll give a very sort of abridged version for those who are interested. Effectively, the guy is now 41, 42, that sort of age. Maybe even a bit older than that. Maybe he's 43, 44. He has just been released in 2014 from a 14-year prison sentence. He was a guy who apparently had a variety of mental health issues throughout his career, culminating in him receiving a 14-year prison sentence for some sort of assault on a woman. I won't go into the specifics of that because I don't know the details and I probably shouldn't talk about it in too much specifics with that in mind. Anyway, my understanding is, having been released from prison in the States, there is some suggestion that he may try and make a return to the ring in oncoming years. I mean, perhaps similar to Amir Mansour, who we see boxing at a late age, having spent his youth incarcerated. And maybe he's someone who could still be a relevant player in the heavyweight division, today, if he is to make a return. He's a Nigerian guy, and I understand after his prison sentence, he may well have been held in custody by the Department for Immigration and whatever. So it's not been easy for the guy. Not only has he had a 14-year prison sentence, which has robbed him of the majority of his career, it's also unclear whether he's going to be able to stay in the US, whatever. So, effectively, to describe the guy briefly, he's a very, very well-built heavyweight, very big man. BoxRec lists him as 6'2", but having seen a few of his fights, I'd say potentially he was even a bit taller than that. He's got a bodybuilder type physique. Imagine Larry Olabamiwo pre his ban. We're talking about a guy who is not only very muscular, very bulky, but is also extremely ripped out. He had surprising speed for a man of his size. He could throw reasonably snappy combinations. His hand speed wasn't too bad, and he was obviously a very big, very strong, very powerful heavyweight with a relative degree of athleticism. I've read various comments about him online suggesting that he may or may not have been using performance-enhancing drugs. For the purpose of this video, we'll take the stance that he wasn't, because I don't know either way. Now, he had a 20-fight pro career, 20 wins, no losses, so undefeated. 15 of his 20 wins coming by way of knockout. Now, of his 20 fights, there are only 2 of them that are remotely relevant in the context of could he be considered an all-time great based on achievements and based on potential. Those 2 fights are a unanimous decision win over David Tua and a knockout win over Chris Burd. Now, those are both strong wins. It would be worth saying that this guy knocked out Chris Burd when Chris Burd was undefeated. This guy beat David Tua when David Tua was undefeated. Chris Burd, we saw him obviously fight Vitaly Klitschko in that fight where he won due to an injury against Klitschko. We also see him fight Vladimir Klitschko, and I think went the distance once, went quite late in another fight. It's interesting that despite all of Chris Bird's career and despite all of Chris Bird's fights against the Klitschko brothers and other big names, it's actually EK who knocked him out earliest. I think it was a 5th round stoppage. So this guy clearly packs power. He sparked out Chris Bird quicker than the Klitschko brothers, and he dealt with him. Clearly a guy with some potential and some talent. Against David Tua, there was a close decision. I think one of the judges had it only 1 or 2 rounds apart. I thought EK deserved to win the fight. I've rewatched it just now. He's sort of slightly quicker to the punch, seemed to be slightly more active than David Tua. So he had a lot going for him. He obviously carried huge power, as was shown in the Chris Burd fight. He was able to stand with David Tua for 12 rounds, so not bad stamina for such a big man, reasonable power, reasonable durability, and as I've already mentioned, good combinations, good speed for a large man. This is a guy who did have some potential, and this is a guy who, had he not been incarcerated, we could have well seen him, fight the likes of the Klitschko brothers. The difficulty is, the question I was asked is, would we consider EK a top 30 fighter based on his potential? And I think that's difficult. A top 30 all-time great heavyweight. Vulnerabilities were clear in both the David Tua fight and the Chris Burd fight. Now, I watched the Chris Burd fight again this morning, and the commentators who were watching at the time had EK ahead at the time of the stoppage. I was actually inclined to disagree with them. I quite liked the work Chris Burd was doing in that fight. He was landing more accurately, his percentage of punches was higher, his defence, I found EK, whilst he was heavy-handed, he was somewhat predictable, he was plodding forward a bit, his movement was slightly one-dimensional. We saw Chris Burd able to anticipate his shots. Chris Bird's head movement caused him problems and led to inaccuracy. Further in that fight, as well as the David Tua fight, there seemed to be some defensive frailties with EK. Don't get me wrong, he's a tough, durable, strong man. It's not like he was getting hurt, but we saw punches landing with reasonable regularity from both Tua and from Chris Burd. So, there were some issues with the guy. I mean, defensively, he wasn't the soundest. There was a bit of inaccuracy. And I think the blueprint on how to beat him was shown by Chris Burd. Somebody who, I guess Chris Burd known as a very pure, very technical, very skilled boxer. He was able to kind of move around him. He was able to kind of keep him, score against him, pick him off with the jab, constantly land scoring shots against him. And even though Chris Burd wasn't successful, a fighter watching that could think that they could expose EK, that they could move around him, they could use a jab, they could find gaps in his defence. And even though he won that fight, and it was very impressive to knock out an undefeated Chris Burd, you got the impression that this was a guy who could lose, and could lose to a Chris Burd type fighter, maybe someone who was a bit bigger than Chris Burd. Chris Burd and David Tua are both very, very solid fighters, solid yardsticks, especially if we consider that at the time when EK beat them, they were both undefeated. However, there's been a lot of very, very good heavyweights, and in terms of determining if someone was a top 30 heavyweight, it's hard to promote anyone to that level when they've had 20 fights. 18 of them are pretty much irrelevant in terms of legacy of all-time great perspective. And the two fights that are relevant are against Chris Burd and David Tua. There's no sort of... Chris Burd and David Tua, they are good fighters, but they're not going to go down as the best of their generation. They're not right at the top of the penthouse, that we say. This guy doesn't have a win against an all-time great himself. Against David Tua, it was a close fight. I mean, he deserved to win, but it was close. He was beatable that day. Against Chris Burd, he showed some frailties. He wasn't a defensive master. So, what was his potential? Well, to my eyes, he was a very big guy, a very durable guy, a very powerful guy, about to come into quite a weak heavyweight division in the last sort of 5-6 years. Could he have been a relevant player? Of course. But is there scope that he could have been exposed? Is there scope that someone like a David Haye, someone like a Vladimir Klitschko, someone like an Alexander Povetkin would just be too dynamic, too athletic for him? Would their movement and technical capability mean they could outpoint him, be first to the punch, move around him, expose his defensive capabilities? The guy clearly had potential. He was beating Tua. He was beating Chris Burd. But did he have the potential to be a dominant heavyweight? I don't think so. And I think that there's a tendency to overrate a guy when there's this mystery about him, you know, him being incarcerated when he was at his peak of his powers, when he was undefeated, when he was 20-0, when he was beating guys like Chris Burd. The point is, EK was a good heavyweight, very solid, lots of attributes. But he didn't beat anyone right at the top of the tree, and he showed clear frailties to his game. In terms of top 30 heavyweights, there's just too many good guys who've come before him, who've beaten better opposition, who are less obviously frail. There are too many guys who wouldn't have dropped 5 rounds to David Tua. There were too many guys who wouldn't have been as inaccurate against Chris Burd, or wouldn't have been moved about by Chris Burd as easily. And because of that, whilst we'll never know, and whilst there clearly was potential there, I just can't see this guy being a top 30 or probably even a top 50 heavyweight in the all-time list. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching. Very interesting topic, by the way. Look forward to receiving more requests. Cheers.